let's get going because we have a lot of ground to cover. Hello, everyone. So for you who do not know me, I'm Lieckens. I'm the product manager of product connectors at Sitecore. I'm also the regional coordinator for the MVPs in the region. There's a couple of products I manage at Sitecore, which gives me a lot of views on what we're doing across the portfolio with APIs. So hence this session. So what can you expect from this session? I'm going to try and keep it very high level because we have a huge portfolio suite. So we have tons of stuff. We're going to be talking about application programming interfaces, APIs, and the overview of what they are, when to use them, and where you can find the documentation mainly. So to give you a general overview of everything. And because I know we're at SUGCON, I try to get my meme skills back in order. So I know your attention is going to go a little bit up. So application programming interfaces. I'm sure you're all aware it's connection between computer and computer systems. It's the interface. But the weird thing is that when everyone hears this, most people immediately, their mind goes off to RESTful APIs and all of that. And starting when we, all the way back, who remembers these? They were also called APIs. So the way that we see APIs now and the way we've seen APIs back then has changed over time. So a few years later, today we're talking APIs. Most of them are all HTTP based or some form of it. And the rest, it really kicked in around the 2000s. And afterwards, we saw GraphQL come into the scene. And nowadays, if I talk to people at Sitecore, we're talking about gRPC services. And some people, depending on who you ask, they see webhooks as well as a form of APIs. Some say it's a reverse API because you don't go and ask for the data, you ask the system to send you the data. Another thing that we definitely need to mention is OData. A lot of our services still have some connection to OData. Another term you might be hearing a lot is Swagger and OpenAPI. For those that do not know, it's like the documentation, self-documenting API, which fortunately for a couple of our APIs, we have this spec, so it's relatively easy to talk to them. Now, I'm going to start in what's the most familiar territory, I would say, for most of you, which is Sitecore. And if you've been to George's session right before, the first one, I think, is going to be very familiar. And he went pretty deep into this one, so luckily I don't have to go too deep into it, which is the item service. It's still one of the APIs that we have. It has a limited OData API endpoint. I say limited because not all OData operations are available. Most of them are. It's read-only access if you use the OData endpoint. But then there's the RESTful API of the same service, which you can use to do all of the CRUD operations for Sitecore items. Now, and search, you can execute from there as well. It has a JS SDK if you want to use it. And then it has entity service on top of it, which also has a JS SDK. And the entity services are more of a business view that you impose on top to give your more meaningful queries. Like if if you just ask for an item of a certain template, that doesn't say much. But if you can ask for a blog post, that's a lot more interesting. Now, why or when would you use these? Personally, I've always used this one more in a backend kind of fashion. So when you are dealing with adding something to the Sitecore stack that your marketeers are interacting with, or to do integrations on certain levels. The documentation, you can find it right there. I hope we'll be sharing the decks afterwards, so you'll have all the links, and if not, I will share them somewhere. So also keep in mind, if you have questions, note them down, because we're going to go through all of the systems pretty quickly. So next API, xConnect. xConnect, again, limited OData API. So that's why I said, like, we really loved OData at that point in time. It was a very common thing to do. Still very usable today, I would say, if you love working with Excel, for example, to query data. OData is great for that. Limited again, like most operations are there, not all of them. Just keep that in mind if you're hitting up to a certain barrier. Authentication for xConnect is mainly dealt with certificates. You can use other methods if you really want to, because as most things, at least in the platform, you have control over the IIS that hosts this, so you can do a lot of things with it. Main usage of this API, of course, is access to your contacts and analytics. I've personally used it a lot when integrating with other systems who have to exchange a lot of data. And this is a great endpoint to do it. Another way to do it would be, of course, using the data exchange framework if you want to go down that route. Service route for this one and fetching the schema if you're interested in looking what's inside of there. Now, the xConnect does have a C# SDK. And it is an SDK that you can leverage also outside of Sitecore. It's a bit tricky to get the connectivity right due to the certificate authentication that's going on. But if you can connect there and you're just running background stuff that needs to happen, it's a great way to do it. And all of the documentation, again, you're going to see a lot of documentation links in here, right there. Now, moving into headless services, that's our newest set, it's these two. I'm just going to put them up real quick. These are two APIs you're most likely never going to touch, but I do want to mention them here. They're part of like how JSS imports its data into the system, and how that all gets hooked up, configured, and gets going if you're using a code-first approach. All of the headless services are using API key authentication, like the Sitecore Service Client. So Sitecore Service Client, same one as the item service. So same system, same location where you define the API keys, and you can connect with this API. A more interesting one that I think a lot of you might have used either consciously or unconsciously, depending on what side of the fence you're on, is our layout service, of course. The older version rests, but there's now a GraphQL version of it as well, thanks to certain developments. It gives a JSON output of the layout of either a complete item, so that's a full page, or a placeholder, if you just want just a piece of your page, which gives you some interesting options if you want to work on your headless application and you're going like, oh, I want to do some custom personalization with some logic that I've written myself, you can just like fetch that piece of the page, swap things out. You can see there's a couple of pieces here that you need to input. The most important ones, of course, being the key so that you can get connected. And the other interesting one is this one, I would say, tracking true or false. Take note of that, because whether that one is true or false determines whether this goes into analytics, yes or no. So if you're doing calls on a page, a lot of them, you don't want to have all of those calls maybe in analytics, because then you're going to blow up your visitor count, while in reality it was just one visitor. So keep that in mind if you're using this endpoint. There's a ton of SDKs for this one, obviously, because this is connected to JSS. So there is the ASP.NET one for the rendering host, if you're working on that side. And for JSS, there's for Next.js, React, Angular, Vue, and React Native experimentally. And all of the documentation on this one is on this URL. There's another service, which is dictionary service. It's on this endpoint. Takes very simple, just an app and a language. It will return you a JSON like this, which is just all of your keys from your dictionary, which is great if you have some labels that you want to translate or stuff like that. The SDK, by the way, is also part of the JSS SDK itself, so it's just another NPM package. Documentation on this one. The other one is the tracking service, and if you want your analytics events tracked right, do so yourself. Now, tracking service is disabled by default. So if you don't enable it, no one's going to be able to connect to it. But it allows you to register goals, page views, campaigns, events, all that kind of stuff. But it needs an item ID to track against. And this creates sometimes a couple of interesting issues, because you might not have items for all of the things that you have in your front-end head, your headless head. It's not related directly anymore to some of your items. So you might need to create some ghost items that are being used for analytics tracking purposes. All of that data, of course, goes into the XDB, like all of the stuff in platform. There's an NPM package to leverage it, and more documentation is on this URL. Now, another one from our headless suite of APIs is the forms service. And this one handles, obviously, the forms part of the story. It's an extension of the layout service. It's basically where you send your form submissions. So it's very simple. There's an NPM package again, part of the JSS stuff. This is the flow, if you're interested. So it's these two are like the key points where this service comes into play. And most likely, you won't be talking to this one directly, I would hope, unless you're doing custom forms and for some reason you want to submit it through this service. But usually, you're just going to grab that NPM package and have it render the form for you so that the marketeer has full control. More documentation. This one was pretty deeply covered by George as well in the previous session, so I'm quite glad to see that he explained the whole idea around GraphQL, because it's become a bit of an important thing in the platform, not only on platform level, but also on the SaaS systems and what we're doing. So, interestingly, you can have multiple isolated endpoints of your GraphQL. So, in theory, if you wanted to, you could create specific GraphQL configurations with different schema, operations, and extensions just by going into Sitecore's configuration and create a couple of patch files and have them purposed for different things. that can be interesting if you're running like a platform with multiple brands and you just want certain things to be available for a certain brand. You can differentiate with your endpoints like that. All of the documentation is out there. I'm going to touch on this one again a bit later. But first, I want to jump into Content Hub. So, platform. Now we're moving more into a SaaS world. Content Hub first. Hate OS. I don't know if anyone heard that one before. Show of hands. Anyone knows what this means? So, it's. I also always have to read it because it's. So it's. Let's see. Oh, I forgot to put. Oh no, I put it on the slide, of course. Hypermedia is the engine of the application state. So there's another term in here which most people don't recognize. Is like hypermedia. What the hell does that mean? And hypermedia is just media, but with links. So hyperlinks, things like that. And if you would go and look into the Content Hub API, you're going to see there's tons of links. I know they're not readable, but that's not the point of these. All of these are all hyperlinks. And you could theoretically browse the entire Content Hub API without knowing anything about it, without having any documentation on it. A human could like click through and discover this API on its own. Which is really nice because it gives you an idea each time that you are looking at a certain point. You see the links of like what other operations are available in this location, so you can like navigate through the API just like you would with a website. The only difference is the output is going to be all these JSON. Now, Content Hub API. Interestingly, Content Hub was API first. It might not be something that you feel when you're using Content Hub, because most people see the portal of Content Hub. But that portal is built entirely on this API, and everything that Content Hub can do is in the API. There is nothing in the front-end portal that you can't do with the API. Uses OAuth authentication. There is an SDK both for C# as well as your JavaScript NPM. It is unlikely that, or I would definitely not recommend that you do this unless you have a good reason for doing so, that you would have this API being used in any of your actual customer-facing front ends. Not gonna happen, because this is a management API. If you want to have that data for your customers, that's what our edge is for. And I'm going to go into the edge later. So when do you use this thing? When you're doing integrations with Content Hub and other systems, server, or if you're building, an example that I know of is like when you create an additional small web application which is authenticated only to certain users to operate certain things that both go into Content Hub and custom systems. So you create your own little application for that. That's when you bring out this API. There is a limitation on this API. It is throttled. And this sometimes like hangs up people when they start seeing 429 codes coming back. If you use the SDKs, SDK handles all of that for you. It automatically backs off and waits so that it can do all the operations you're requesting. But just a heads up if you're just going yourself and smashing that API, trying to import like 1,000 DAM systems or assets or something like that. Again, a lot of documentation available. Note, slightly different URL here. So it's not always easy to find all the documentation, which is also one of the reasons why I wanted to do this. So let's talk about Edge, because Edge goes across these two systems and across some of the others as well. I should really have thought of a better Edge meme, but all of the memes got too edgy. So first, XM part. It's going to be, I hope this one's going to be readable, because there's a lot of endpoints on these that I want to call out. The first one is the actual delivery endpoint. This is where you connect to with your applications. There's the IDE, so you can test out your stuff. That's the GraphQL that was being mentioned in George's session if you were there. There is the preview, of course, which allows you to have an idea of what you can expect from the GraphQL without having to actually push all of your stuff to the real edge already. So you can see and try out and develop against this endpoint. Or if you really want to see like updated latest data versus the published data. IDE, notice this one goes IDE, this one goes UI. Don't ask me why that happened, but it tripped me up every single time I go like /UI. Oh no, that doesn't work, /UI. There's a token and an admin point as well. This is for management purposes. Unlikely that you're gonna hit this one unless through the actual portal of Content Hub, but you could theoretically use this one to configure your own tokens if you're doing certain things surrounding security. It makes things a little bit more difficult. So all of this GraphQL, and for XM, note that the media here is also coming from Edge, which brings me to a couple of limitations. First limitation, everything on the Edge is public. Public is public. If you have the token, you can go through all of the data. So there's no security systems in that space. So if you bring something to the Edge, make sure that it should be public. It takes a snapshot of the layout service. So what does that mean? No personalization. So you have to use different means of personalization. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you need different ways of dealing with the personalization after the delivery of the page. And for that media here, in the XM side, it's 50 megabytes max. Just a limitation to be aware of. Most websites don't use anything bigger than that, but hey, I used to be in a company that even put all of their drivers up there. So that were like 100, 200 megabyte downloads of zip files. So yeah, that wouldn't work with the Edge. On the Content Hub side, it's easy. Same endpoints, because it's all Edge. The preview, of course, changes a little bit. You have to connect to these with your Content Hub URL. All of that looks under the covers a little bit like this. It's just to give you some idea, there is a different schema because, of course, for Content Hub, it is more configurable. The way you have your entity definitions going on. So that reflects in the GraphQL as well. And you can create content collections, which is interesting. For example, again, with the brands, if you have multiple ones, you can have content collection for one brand and for another one. And then also have a token that only functions with that particular collection, which gives you some separation of concerns. It requires a CMP and Edge license. So if you don't have those, you can't play with these APIs, I'm sorry. And in this case, you can see here, we don't have the limitations of 50 megabytes because Content Hub actually has already a mechanism to deliver all of that media, which bypasses not really the Edge because it's an Edge in itself. So putting an Edge on an Edge would not make sense. The xGQL token, yeah. I didn't mention that one here in the authentication yet. So those tokens, they go into a specific header. If you want some more information, all of that right here. And you might notice here also it says CaaS, so content as a service might be another name that you hear for this system. Headed into commerce, we have more APIs over there. And when I'm designing an XC solution, I feel a little bit like this. So commerce, again, OData very heavily. Role-oriented APIs, authoring shops and ops, depending on what you're doing. The first one is for backend stuff. Second one is for what you actually are delivering in your shops. And the third one is for your actual environment setup and everything. Bearer token authentication based on Sitecore identity. So all of the tokens are coming from that side. And the end, I haven't like really made an overview of all of the endpoints because it depends what you have put into your commerce solution. Because it's an API that you partially built yourself. There is a lot that comes out of the box if you're using it. If you're not using it, you can tear it out. So it's very, for lack of a better word, composable, if you want to call it that. And all of the documentation on that one is on this URL. Now, we have another very great commerce API, and this is our SaaS version. And they're not the same as some of the others out there. They can do B2C, B2B, and B2B2X. So it has like a very good data model to handle all of those. And not only that, it's API first and almost could call only, because that's what you're really getting, and that's the powerful part. It is REST. There's SDKs, again, for JavaScript as well as C#, NPM, NuGet, you know the deal. There is middleware for .NET that you can leverage. It's called Catalyst. There is also a full-blown implementation example called Head Start. If you really want to see like what you can achieve using these APIs, have a look. And I also very highly recommend the Postman tutorial that is being provided from the documentation. It is a great experience to go through all of the concepts that this API covers. And yeah, it is RESTful. And one of the things I also want to point out is the extensible data model. It has ways of adding the data that you need to the actual out-of-the-box model as well. And this is the documentation, and this is the OpenAPI spec. So fully documented, everything's there. Go have a look. Headed into CDP. So more APIs. CDP does a lot of interesting things with the data that it receives. First one is the Stream API, and that's most likely the one you're gonna interact with, I would say, or if you're looking at it. So the first one, Browser API. This one is to identify the guest. Endpoint is right here. You can see here the client ID. That's authentication on this one. And then there's the Event API. And yeah, the name suggests, it will get all of the events. And there are a lot of events out of the box. These are just the names of the ones you can find, but you can add your own as well. So there's no limitation on that one. This is the endpoint for sending in events. So authentication shared between client key. The SDK is JavaScript. There is a beacon that you can install, so you don't have to manually do all of this. You can also just add on the beacon and configure it from there, which is going to be most likely how you interact with this API, but it's always interesting to know what's going on under the covers. So capture behavioral data, and a couple of things that are important to know. It is write only, so there's no reading from this API. It's asynchronous, so you don't need to wait for any responses. And the API endpoint is specific to your region. So make sure you have the correct one. We have Europe, US, and Asia Pacific right now. So the endpoints are in the documentation if you want to have a look. Then there's the REST API. So this one takes an API key and a secret if you want to be talking to this one, because this one does read-write and allows you interaction with like all of the guest data, the extensions, the audiences, flow execution. This is the API you'll be using if you're getting into some of the personalization of your head and interactions with that. All of the documentation, again, beautifully available right there. Then there's the batch API. And I'm going to go through this one a little bit faster because sadly, I have been informed that this one is getting deprecated pretty soon. So I do have the slide with all of the information here, but it is likely that it will vanish in the future. Headed into Send. Now, first, Send API, RESTful API again. API key to authenticate against it. And it gives you access to mailing lists, subscribers, campaigns, and segments. So this is if you want to send in or sync data with your systems and get your, well, the last thing I did was getting contacts out of the XDB and moving them into Send, so a migration story. REST API is perfect for that. And it's also very nicely documented on Apiary, if you want to have a look. The documentation of Send API is currently being rebranded, so this URL might change in the future, so just keep that in mind. But interestingly, you would think if you read that documentation, you know all about the Send APIs, perhaps. But we have a couple of other APIs that you might want to know about, and the first one being the collector service. It's a RESTful endpoint. It takes the site ID as a header to authenticate against it, and it goes on this URL, so which might already betray what it's doing, actually. It is just like the CDP's event API. This is the Send version of it, actually. There is an SDK, which is, again, a beacon mood track, which allows you to more easily talk to this API. But you could theoretically also send in your data directly from your commerce system, for example, which is a good one. So it gathers analytics, which is then used for Send to do some of its personalization. Most important call, identify, just the same one as the browser API of CDP. We need to know who we're talking about. And then these are the out-of-the-box events, but you can add your own, just the same. So that's part of track. And yeah, currently no documentation, sorry, but I'm sure it will come in the future. Then there's also the automations management service API. Again, RESTful service, you also need the API key to talk to it. And it's on this endpoint, so yet another URL. And this one handles all of the automations in Send. So you can also do marketing automation with Send, and this is the endpoint that handles all of those. Not part of the main RESTful API right now, but I do believe it will move up there in the future, or it will be made available in some way or form. If you look at the portal of Send while you're doing calls, you will actually see this one being used, and you can actually learn a little bit from how the portal calls to this API if you want to do certain automations yourself, like adding a user into an automation programmatically. This is the API you would use for it. Again, no documentation currently, but definitely coming in the future. Then heading into Discover, and I think most people have not seen a lot of these or interacted with them. So you guessed it, we have more capturing of analytical events on this one first. So we have the Events API here as well. Again, RESTful API. Again, there's a JavaScript beacon to talk to it. But this one has a couple of very interesting things that I did not see in the other ones, which are the dev tools. So if you would go into your Sitecore Discover, there's an event monitor that you can, as a developer, look at to see which events are passing through my API right now. And there's an event builder, which will allow you to construct an event in the right way so that you have the right payload to send it into the API, which is a nice touch. And all of the documentation on that one, again, is on this one. Then we have the incremental feed API. More RESTful APIs. Who would have guessed? API key is what you need to talk to this one. And the data you're going to be sending into this one is the products, store, restriction, availability, locale, and attributes of your products. So Discover right now is mainly tuned for product searches. And you will move all of your product data in like one big batch upload through another location. It's SFTP, so it's not really an API, sadly, but you move that in, and then this API is what you use to keep all of that information up to date as the changes happen in the PIM or any other location where you have it. And all of the documentation on that is found right there. And then last but not least, in the Discover suite, we have the Search and Recommendation API. Again, REST. This one takes, depending on the version, it will ask for an API key bearer, but that's being deprecated. You can actually talk to this one without authentication because this is the one that goes into your front end. So, and what you're getting back mainly from this one are suggestion, the facets, the filters, the content results. So this is the API you're using to build your screen if you're building your head. And all of that documentation right over there. So in conclusion, it's all APIs, and it always has been, whether it was just a DLL endpoint where we were talking to the public interface of that DLL. Today we're talking to RESTful services with GraphQL, gRPC, OData. And I'm quite sure that in the future, we'll just keep finding better ways of using and abusing our APIs. And I'm mainly very, very curious to see what you guys are all going to be up to when you're going through our product suite and dealing with all of these. So with that, questions?
How about this deprecation of Batch API? What is going to be replaced with?
There's sadly no answer to that yet. And I learned of it like literally 2 days ago. So by asking the question, like I stumbled across something small in the Batch API that asks that you send a ID into the JSON that is actually being generated by CDP. So I was like, if you're doing a migration of data, how do you get that ID and then put it into your batch before you upload it? And by posing that question, actually the product management told me like, this one is going to get deprecated. So, but I also asked what's coming next. No reply to that yet, but as I hope next year or at Symposium, we can give you an update on that one.
Thanks. Are we going to normalize the APIs? Because there are different kind of flavors, variants, how you can do it. It's like, that should be nice.
Yes, that is the plan, definitely in the future. Personally, where I would, because like, I'm going to take off my Sitecore hat for a second and put it down. Me as a developer, personally, I would love to see that we go forward to a place where we have a single gateway which covers all of our APIs, has one authentication system that you can work with, and that we have each capability just in there, easy to use, using the same systems and capabilities, and that you can just leverage all of Sitecore without thinking almost. That you don't have to think anymore about, oh, this is CDP, or this is that part of the product. Like that, all of that actually vanishes under this big universal Sitecore API that just has all of the capabilities of Sitecore. And you as a developer can say like, well, today I need some DAM assets. So I'm just gonna go and add DAM assets. And tomorrow I want to do some personalization and I want to give some events. So I'll put those events into the API in that location. Because you've seen we currently have 4 locations where we're accepting analytical events. That's definitely going to become one in the future. So that's coming.
Yeah, so very simple question. You discovered a lot of APIs for us. Were there also APIs that you expected to find but couldn't?
I would say that like the ones that I showed for Send, I expected to find those in the documentation and I didn't find them. I actually stumbled onto them while I was doing an analysis for Send specifically to show how you could do certain things with Send. Especially because Send has for the collector service, here's a little interesting story actually. The collector service, you have in Send a component that is called product recommendation. But you might ask yourself, like, how do you get products into Send? There's like no API, as you've seen, there's no API for that. There's nowhere you can upload your products. So what Send actually does is, by listening to the traffic on your website, it picks up all of the products that you have on the website, and that's actually how they build up your product catalog and do product recommendations. So if there's a product that has never been seen by anyone, it is not going to be recommended because it's purely an event that actually triggers that existence of that product in Send.